Okay, so shall we start? Okay, all right. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce our second plenary speaker. Robyn Carston is a professor of linguistics at University College London and fellow of British Academy. Robyn's research focuses on pragmatics and on its interfaces with semantics and with other cognitive systems, in particular the theory of mind system. In her extensive publication, Robyn demonstrated how context-sensitive pragmatics processes play an essential role in the recovery of speakers' intended meaning, not only in inferring the implication of an utterance, but also in driving its explicitly communicated content. Robyn is currently working on two main projects. The first is pragmatic routes to the understanding of metaphor and related non-literal use of language. And the second one is the nature of lexical meaning and its relation to the concept we express or communicate. In this talk today, Robyn is going to talk about the paper titled Pragmatics, Pragmatic Lexicon and Complex Words. So I'll pass on to you now, Robyn.
Thank you very much, Ryoko. And since I'm the last speaker, I would like to reiterate the thanks of all of us to you and Kate for your superb organization of this conference and very supportive emails, especially when I was having enormous problems, computing problems, Zoom problems, and also for running the Relevance Researchers Network for the past 2 years, keeping us all up to date with new work in the theory. You've done a really, really great job there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so my title has slightly changed. It's sort of expanded. It's now the Pragmatic Lexicon, Ad Hoc Concepts, Polysemy, and Complex Words. Essentially, it's various components of lexical pragmatics. So let me just launch in. Consider Jill and Jack. Jill is a philosopher. She has a PhD in philosophy. She has a lectureship in the Department of Philosophy at a particular university, but she has plagiarized other people's work and has no real interest in philosophical ideas or arguments. Jack, on the other hand, is a janitor. He also works at University X, where he takes care of the cleanliness of the buildings. He has long conversations with students about the meaning of life. He has convinced the university to use eco-friendly detergents based on an elaborate moral argument concerning benefits to the environment. A student remarks, Jack is a true philosopher. These examples come from a talk that I attended recently at the PLM conference in Warsaw by a PhD student, Lucien Baumgartner, I think is the way to pronounce his name, on what he called the lexical pragmatics of dual character concepts. And this was a delightful talk to my mind because it was a philosopher taking on board what we've said in relevance theory about lexical pragmatics. So dual character concepts, this is a notion from philosophy, have a descriptive and normative dimension. So philosophers descriptively might have the following characteristics: that they read Aristotle and Plato, that they have a doctorate in philosophy, that they're employed to teach or research in philosophy. And then there is this normative dimension, that is the way that we think philosophers should be, what we expect from them, namely that they think hard about abstract problems, that they're critical and analytical, and that they are seekers of the truth. Both of these dimensions can be used to classify individuals. And as has been noted by philosophers like Sarah Jane Leslie, the classification on either dimension is independent of the classification on the other dimension. So Jill is a philosopher, descriptively speaking, but she's not a philosopher, normatively speaking. Jack is not a philosopher, descriptively speaking. He's a janitor, but arguably he is a philosopher in the normative sense. There are lots of other potential dual character concepts. So poet, we'll talk about somebody being a poet, even though they might not have published any poetry or even write poetry as such, but perhaps they express themselves in a very evocative way. So they would fit the normative dimension. Mary is a true poet, something like that. And the same could be said for scientist, teacher, artist, criminal, and a whole bunch of others, even man and woman. So there was a statement, I don't know by whom actually, along the following lines, that Hillary Clinton was the only man in Obama's administration. And there, what was being invoked was some sort of social norm about men's behavior. She obviously wasn't descriptively a man, but she fitted this normative dimension. What are the limits of these kinds of concepts? Well, any concept for which there is a description or a definition and norms concerning the appropriate or expected way of being or behaving for an entity meeting that description can be dual character concepts. It's difficult to say how far this extends. What about mechanic, or optician, or postman, or waitress? Seems a bit odd to say about John, who doesn't work as an optician, hasn't trained as an optician, to say, oh, John is a true optician. Or of Mary, who is, let's say, a university professor in some context, to say, oh, Mary is a true waitress, trying to invoke some sort of normative dimension there. These just seem intuitively less likely to be dual character concepts, and this is supported by empirical work, which Lucien Baumgartner presented to us in his talk in Warsaw. But there's a but to this, as you will see. These dual character concepts are things like philosopher, poet, scientist, and so on. They're treated by philosophers as cases of lexical polysemy. So they give a sort of semantic account of them, that namely dual character concepts correspond to polysemous terms. So there's a word in the English language, philosopher, and it's polysemous. It has the descriptive concept and the normative concept, and they're related. They're just two distinct senses of a word, both being literal meanings of the expression listed in the lexicon. Now, Lucien Baumgartner's insight in his talk, as presented in his talk, is that in certain contexts, terms that do not actually encode dual character concepts can nevertheless exhibit dual character if a norm is salient in the context. So the ability to express and understand these concepts actually, he says, requires a pragmatic explanation. And he wants to give that pragmatic explanation in terms of ad hoc concept formation in the process of communication, interpretation. So here are his two main claims. Almost any concept can be used like a dual character concept, he says. And this dual character concept classification pattern can be comprehensively explained by lexical pragmatics as developed in relevance theory. Consider potato. Well, surely this is not a dual character concept. Well, consider the following attested examples from the Urban Dictionary. Mary is such a potato. David asked me to the prom, but he's a potato, so I'm not going. Our professor is such a potato. And dude, I'm a potato. I hope you're having a little giggle there, but because I can't hear anything. Okay, so here's what Lucien Baumgartner had to say about the potato case in particular. And this slide is essentially taken directly from him. So potato can have a normative dimension, he says. It can allude to norms of social recognition. Potatoes on such a norm can be considered dull, unpopular, boring. Standards of beauty, potatoes are plain, unattractive. Norms of productivity or efficiency, so this would involve laziness or slobbishness. So the dude, I'm a potato, was actually in his talk was accompanied by some great images of people lounging on couches, watching television, eating a lot, drinking a lot, and in a very sort of decadent stance, as it were. So he says there is a double dissociation in the case of potato. The true potato can be a dull, plain, or lazy person. Most members of Solanum tuberosum, that is the potato vegetable, are not true potatoes. And true potatoes, which includes people, are not necessarily members of Solanum tuberosum. So just like the philosopher case, we get the double dissociation. So potato can be used like a dual character concept, but it's not a lexical polysemy. And this was his primary point. It is a case of ad hoc concept formation. Potato then, the potato concept comes with what he called lexical information. We might call it encyclopedic information. Potatoes are not considered very pretty nor exciting. They are quite bland, shapeless, and thrive best underground, away from discerning eyes. And then he said, well, if the literal meaning of potato appears to be deficient or unfit for the current communicational purposes, we start interpreting the utterance more loosely. In that case, this information acts as contextual, that is the lexical or encyclopedic information, acts as contextual premises in deriving contextual implications. So we get that the person is boring or unattractive or lazy, as the case may be, depending on which norm is being invoked. And the process of online concept adjustment stops as soon as expectations of relevance are satisfied. Okay, so this is just really our standard story of pragmatic modulation with these two different dimensions, the descriptive content and the normative content just being aspects of encyclopedic information, activated to different levels in different contexts, such that we may derive ad hoc word meanings on the basis of some of this encyclopedic information. So to take the case again of Jack, the janitor, is a true philosopher. We can think of this as philosopher star. Professor Plink is a potato star. Both of these are broadenings of the original, what we might think of as the original concept, the descriptive concept, with also a degree of narrowing. So just to spell out the relevance-based pragmatic account, so it's on the table for what I want to say for the rest of the talk. The concept philosopher, encoded by the word philosopher, gives us access to a file of information about philosophers. Items of this encyclopedic information will differ in their degree of activation. The accessibility ranking will alter across contexts of use of the word philosopher, depending on the other activated concepts and their interaction. Hearers will access information in order of degree of activation, deriving implications. So in this case, things like Jack, our janitor, is deeply thoughtful. He can mount convincing moral arguments. He cares about truth and fairness. And this process stops when sufficient implications have been derived to satisfy the presumption of optimal relevance. At the same time, importantly, there's a parallel process of adjustment, modulation of the meaning of the word philosopher by backwards inference, giving us the ad hoc concept philosopher star, which is broader in denotation than that of the encoded concept philosopher, because as well as actual philosophers, it includes some people who are technically non-philosophers like Jack, but it's also narrower, as it excludes some people who are employed as philosophers, who are descriptively philosophers, like Jill. So here's the basic picture, and this is sort of the standard picture of what goes on in meaning modulation when we have a broadening and a narrowing. So we have the philosopher concept, the denotation there, the blue circle, which contains Jill, and we have the philosopher star, the true philosopher, the normative philosopher, which contains Jack, the janitor. And of course, we would hope there would be a substantial overlap between members of these two denotations. But it's the denotational broadening and the narrowing that gives this double dissociation. So with ad hoc concepts like philosopher star or potato star, we have what we can call, I guess, pragmatic polysemy. And this sometimes evolves into what we could call lexical or semantic polysemy. Thus, the ad hoc senses may become established or lexicalized over time to form what the philosophers have been talking about all along as typical lexical dual character concepts. I suspect that philosopher star has made it into most English speakers' mental lexicons, so it is no longer pragmatically inferred in the way that I just did it, although it does remain inferable. And potato star, I suspect, is still ad hoc for most of us. And indeed, it seems to have an array of subtly different meanings in different contexts. And so it is pragmatically inferred. Okay, so that's just our standard relevance theory lexical adjustment, meaning modulation process applied to so-called dual character concepts. Overview of the talk. Strange time to give it perhaps, but I launched straight into Jack and Jill, so I give it now. I've just done part one, the meaning modulation story, but I've applied it to these cases of dual character concepts following Lucien Baumgartner. I'm going to move in part two to talk about lexical innovation, motivated word coinages, where in effect what we get is an ad hoc word with a new sense, an ad hoc sense. And I'm going to be focusing on conversions and on the pragmatic process of metonymy. So a bit different from the meaning modulation case. And then in part three, I want to look at complex words, which we seldom do actually in relevance theory, lexical pragmatics, words like reactionary, multimorphemic, naturalize, flaky, which have non-compositional senses. I'll say more about that. But my claim is going to be just that. They are further cases of ad hoc concept construction or lexical innovation via meaning modulation and or metonymy. And then I want to end briefly, if I get there, if I have time, to say something about language, the nature of language on two construals, narrow and broad, the generative syntactic system, the narrow view of language, and the pragmatic user-based lexicon on the broader communication-oriented view. Okay, so part two, lexical innovation, conversions. I'm especially thinking here about noun to verb conversions, but the opposite direction is also possible. So here are some newish ad hoc cases, all of them attested. I'm trying to room all the talks in the same building, said by a university administrator at UCL. I don't know that I had heard that use of room before as a verb. Vasco Vasilev prodigied his way through the Carmen Fantasia. Just read that recently. And the one I mentioned this morning, if Trump isn't 25th amendmented in the next 24 hours, then he will never be removed, and there will be another incident that he'll get away with, presumably said soon after the ghastly business at the White House. Not so new cases that have been discussed quite a lot in the literature. The prisoner Houdini'd out of the top security jail, where the verb Houdini is a conversion from the proper name Houdini, specifically referring to Harry Houdini, the escape artist. The factory sirened midday. The police sirened the Porsche to a stop, where the noun siren is being used as a verb, reasonably well established now, probably. I've given the two examples because it's interesting to note that this verb can take a range of different structures. The boy porched the newspapers. The developer porched all the bungalows. So this is the noun porch being used as a verb with two rather different meanings. And then there are these established cases, so established we don't, you wouldn't think about them too much as being conversions, but the verb to hammer, from the noun hammer, to shell walnuts, to remove the shells of walnuts, to starch shirts, to dust the corners of the room, to treasure our time together, based on the noun treasure, and these various vehicle cases, to jet, to jeep, to bike, to bus, where the verbs seem to have been derived from the vehicle nouns. Okay. Sorry, I'm actually reading my notes here because I can't see the screen terribly well. Okay, so I want to talk about these conversion cases, specifically noun to verb, as cases of metonymy. Following Laurie Bauer on this, Bauer 2018. Now, on the traditional view, these conversions are treated as cases of derivational morphology, essentially just like the move from the noun standard to the verb standardize, or the noun code to the verb codify, but with a zero affix, no phonologically realized verbal affix in those cases. But even on that traditional view, people kept noting with uneasiness that the range of meanings of conversion verbs was really very extensive. It was unsystematic and unpredictable, unlike that of typical cases of affixation using things like eyes or ify, as in codify. So I haven't got time to sort of point out these differences, but if you just think about what to room meant in the example given, to prodigy, to porch, and to siren, the meanings are very unsystematic. There isn't a sort of single pattern at work here. Clark and Clark, in a landmark paper back in 1979, when nouns surface as verbs, treated these as cases of lexical innovation, so as a pragmatic phenomenon, new words coined on the fly in communication, a highly creative process, although usually pretty easily comprehended by hearers, thus requiring a pragmatic rather than a syntactic or morphological explanation. Although, of course, that pragmatic explanation would have to be constrained by the new syntactic category, the verbal category. Now, Laurie Bauer has taken this a step further, really, by maintaining that the noun to verb conversions and also verb to noun, which I'm not discussing, are metonymic shifts made by speakers in communication. He says they are typical of figurative interpretations, precisely in being unpredictable and unrestricted. And he's reached this conclusion that they're metonymic shifts somewhat reluctantly, because he's a morphologist and would have more naturally wanted to think of them in terms of derivational morphology. But he was led to this by looking at a big wide range of ad hoc idiosyncratic cases. And he just, in the end, said, yeah, looks like metonymy, looks like something pragmatic. So I've just given one of his examples. There's no space to give the full range that he presents, some of which are really good fun. That's worth looking at his paper. So just one for interest. At a serving table, bottle-scaped with wine, Angelo expertly uncorked 2 bottles of champagne. You can think about what that means. Of course, the compound noun bottlescape is in itself an innovation, I suppose, and then the new verb seems to be built on top of that. Okay, now before saying anything more about this view of conversions as cases of metonymy, let's look at the standard definition of metonymy from the OED. In fact, I got this, I think, from a talk by Deirdre a couple of years ago. So the standard definition is that metonymy is a figure of speech involving substitution of the name of an associated attribute or adjunct for that of the thing that is meant. So we talk about a farm hand, where what we're referring to is the person who works on a farm. The city suits, where we're referring to the people who work in the financial part of London, I guess, and wear a certain kind of suit. The Crown, Downing Street, don't need to explain those, and the ham sandwich, the now famous example coming from Nunberg in the literature to refer to the guy in the cafe who ordered the ham sandwich. And there's a whole bunch of semi-regular cases. So container for contents, he drank the whole bottle, drank the contents of the bottle. Material for artifact, so we talk of glasses and tins and paper and chalk and so forth, for the things that are made from that material. Creator for the work, I've read Dickens. Place for event, so Waterloo, Vietnam, Woodstock. We can say something like Vietnam was a disaster for the American government, meaning the war in Vietnam, and so on. So metonymy is this kind of associative relation of contiguity, as it's often put. It's distinct from a relation of resemblance, which we have in metaphor, or of antonymy, which we might say we have in the case of irony. The contiguity involved is typically spatial, but it can be temporal. So the 1960s were liberal-minded, meaning the people who lived in the 1960s, or many of them were liberal-minded. And it can be causal or resultative. So a painting, the thing, is a result of an act of painting. A reading, in the sense of an interpretation, let's say, of a novel, is the result, it's caused by an act of reading. So those would all be kinds of contiguity and thus metonymic. So it's a rather loose and powerful notion. Notably, these typical cases of metonymy do not involve a change of syntactic category, like the conversions. And in fact, figures of speech don't usually involve a change of word category. They don't usually create a new word, a new verb, for example, based on a noun. So if you think about hyperbole, metaphor, irony, that's just not what those figures do. So it seems that actually conversions maybe don't fit entirely neatly into this standard definition of metonymy given above. Can metonymy bring a new word into existence, and indeed with a change of category, as happens for conversions? Well, in recent relevance-theoretic work, which has been presented, I think, in quite a number of different places now, although I don't think there's yet a published paper, we find the following statement: metonyms are motivated neologisms. That is, metonymic uses arise through natural, spontaneous, pragmatic processes of new word coinage. And this is the position taken by Deirdre Wilson and Ingrid Felcom in work that they've been developing for the last few years. So in other words, I take it that suit, as in city suits, is two words. There's the clothing kind of suit, and there's the person referred to by suit. So there are two words there, and ham sandwich involves two words or two expressions. Now, so how would the pragmatic account of this go? Well, the new word, and specifically we're talking here about its meaning because the phonology is a given. The new word is inferred from accessible information in the encyclopedic entry of the input noun, so suit or hand or ham sandwich. Also information in the wider discourse context and the general topic of conversation, all of which is guided, of course, by the standard relevance theory comprehension procedure. Importantly, this is different from meaning modulation, narrowing, broadening, because the encoded concept or sense, suit or ham sandwich, and the new ad hoc metonymic concept or sense, suit star or ham sandwich star, do not share implications. So the output is in fact a different ad hoc word from the input word. So I'm not going to say more about that. I'm not going to try and mount arguments and so forth. Wilson and Felcom have done that in great detail. What I want to say is that what we've got here is a really nice convergence of independent work. Laurie Bauer on conversions, saying, so conversions again, let me say it again, are new words made from existing words, denominal verbs. He's saying that these are instances of metonymy. And we have Wilson and Felcom on standard metonymies, saying that they are motivated word coinages. We're going to talk about them as denominal nouns, in fact. Okay, so I'm just going to take that as read. I think there's a lot of questions that could be asked there. But okay, so what is the contiguity relation in the case of conversions? That is, what is the relation between the denotation of the noun and the denotation of the verb? Well, it seems that the noun denotation may have just about any salient role in the action of the corresponding verb. It might be an instrument, as in the case of the verb to hammer, to starch, to siren. It might be a location. The noun might be a location, in to porch, to shelve, to house, or maybe some other kind of object in the verbs to dust and to sugar and so forth. And there just are multiple other possibilities, it seems. So if we think about Houdini, well, that one doesn't fit into any of these previous roles that I just mentioned, probably nor does 25th and more bottlescape. So there's a lot of work that could be done here, just analysing exactly how each and every one of these nouns relates to the corresponding verb, which I'm not going to do other than wave my hands and say, well, you know, there's just a vast array of possibilities here. And a possible general worry that sort of creeps into my mind every so often is metonymy seems to be everywhere. Well, it seems to be an awful lot of it. It seems unconstrained. And when you start thinking about metonymy, you start noticing, and I've started noticing it everywhere. The unconstrainedness is, I guess, my point of worry. But I find in the work that Wilson and Falcom have presented that there's a lot of evidence that it really is a very, very prevalent kind of language use. So it arises spontaneously in children, cross-culturally, and very early on, before metaphor. Coda and Falcom have done experiments to show this. It just seems to be a very basic conceptual pragmatic process for making new words, new labels. In experiments that done by various psychologists with no particular stake in our pragmatic arguments, they've found that people consider metonymically related senses to be more closely related than cases involving resemblance, so narrowing, broadening metaphor, and so on. And one example is the work of Klapus-Niotu and Baum. Even though in the metonymic cases, there is in fact less semantic overlap, less sharing of features and properties than in cases related by pragmatic modulation. So there just seems to be something very special, very basic for us humans in metonymic use, in these salient contiguity associations. There's always been this other little worry lurking around about salt and pepper. There's a frequent spatial contiguity between salt and pepper. They're strongly associated in our minds. So then the question could be, well, why can't we use one metonymically for the other? And I think the answer there must come from phonology, that there's a crucial constraint on phonology. They're just too phonologically different to be candidates for the metonymic expression of each other. Okay. So finally, to end this, sorry, not finally, but to end this bit of the talk, I want to point out a consequence of this pragmatic process of lexical innovation. And that is that polysemy turns out to be cross-categorial. That is, a family of senses, of related senses, pragmatically related senses, may be spread across a related noun and verb, as in porch, starch, Houdini, jet, embed, which is a case of a noun formed from the verb, in fact, and even across nouns, verbs, and adjectives. So stone, the adjective, the verb, and the noun. Back can also be adjective, noun, verb, with multiple interrelated senses. So is it really roots, which are typically shown in this way with the square root signs, stone, porch, Houdini, and so forth? Is it really roots that track polysemy, families of interrelated senses? And if so, how is this cognitively represented? After all, it is words, not roots or affixes, that are salient to ordinary language users. We use one-word utterances quite often, but those will be a verb or a noun or an adjective. They won't be a root. And it seems that words are most likely the minimal communication units logged in our pragmatic lexicons, again, not roots. So nouns, verbs, adjectives then, distinct words, even when they're phonologically identical, are each individually stored in our lexicons with their polysemy family. Now, I put a question mark there because I'm not 100% sure about that, but that's an intuition. Some current syntacticians maintain that words, as such, have no status in the grammar. So even things, complex words like nationalize or solidarity are treated as phrasal structures, but so are simple words like cat and run, because the basic elements in the grammar they would maintain are roots and functors, which would include affixes and categorizations like the nominal categorization and so on. And this may be then where we have to find a way of tracking root-based polysemy, because this kind of syntax, this root-based syntax, may model the distinction between polysemy and homonymy in formal terms, so that only polysemous words will share the same syntactic root. This is a position put by syntactician Aquaviva. So there's a single root for the noun, verb, and adjective stone with their pragmatically related meanings, while there are, of course, two roots for bank with its two unrelated meanings, financial and landmass. So this consequence of this treatment of lexical innovation is simply an indication to me that an adequate account of polysemy has to take roots rather than words as its basis, ultimately. Okay, part 3. I come now to complex words, multimorphemic words, and their meanings. So by such a complex word, I mean something like activation. I've given a little structure for it here. The verb act becomes adjectival with the suffix "ive," active, and then a verb with the suffix "ate," activate, and then a noun, activation. This has a compositional semantics. I won't try to go through it rigorously, but you get roughly here something like result of making some entity capable of performing its function, capable of acting. And so here the internal structure of this word maps joint for joint onto its meaning parts. Okay, fine. That's a compositional semantics matching the syntactic structure of the word, or the morphological structure, if you prefer. But many internally complex words seem to have a non-compositional atomic sense or meaning. So reactionary, as it's commonly used nowadays, means roughly backward looking, which is not semantically composed from the verb react plus the affixes shon and airy. And the same goes for actually a great many cases. When one starts thinking about this, one starts to see it all over the place, as with metonymy. So transmission has one meaning, a non-compositional meaning, on which it means a car's gearbox. That is not a composition, a simple composition of the meaning of the verb transmit plus the suffix shon. Similarly for revolution, meaning the overthrow of a government or a social order. Naturalize, meaning to recognize a person as a citizen of a country. Recital, meaning a solo concert. That is not a semantic composition of the meaning of recite plus L. Detectorist, as a person who uses a metal detector as a hobby, much more specific than the compositional meaning. Okay, a couple of things to note before I go on to say something about these non-compositional meanings is firstly that compositional meanings for these words are also available to varying degrees. So I think transmission, the compositional meaning of transmission, is used quite widely. The transmission by the BBC was very well done, or whatever. Demonstration, Mary gave a demonstration of ironing a shirt, something of that sort. And to varying degrees, it may be true of most of the others, that there's also a compositional meaning, which is in use to some extent. The second point to note is that the non-compositional, the idiosyncratic meanings that I discussed on the previous slide, are not completely unrelated to the compositional meanings, or indeed to meanings of other words with the same root. So detect, detective, detector, and detectorist have something in common. We recognize some interrelatedness of their meanings, even though two of them, at least, detective and detectorist, are not semantically compositional. Okay, so then my question is, where do these non-compositional atomic senses come from. And the hypothesis might come as no surprise to you, is that many of these are created in online communication in the same way as the simple monomorphemic cases that I discussed earlier. So by a pragmatic modulation process that results in a meaning or a sense whose denotation is narrower or broader than its input meaning, or by a metonymical shift or some combination of the two.
Okay.
Okay.
Robyn, you have 5 minutes.
Oh, okay, thank you. So consider the complex word detectorist. This is the only one I'll try and do in a wee bit of detail, which has the following structure. So let's say it has a root detect, which is categorized as a verb. Then there's a noun built on that, detector, and then a further noun, detectorist, which has the non-compositional meaning detectorist, which is roughly paraphrasable as a person who uses a metal detector as a hobby. Now, of course, there are lots of different kinds of detectors: smoke detectors, gas detectors, metal detectors, contraband detectors, and so on. But the word detectorist, in its current usage anyway, refers only to someone who uses a metal detector to look for pieces of precious metal. And certainly this restriction on its meaning doesn't come from the ist suffix, which is simply, according to the morphologist Lieber, and certainly this seems right intuitively, is just a suffix for forming person nouns from adjectives and nouns, and so gives us the compositional meaning: someone who uses a detector of any sort. So on the kind of pragmatic account, which would be syntactically constrained, of course, by the fact that we're dealing with a noun, a nominal, so on such a pragmatic account of how this very specific meaning has arisen, the general story would be that the word detectorist has occurred frequently enough in discussions of people who pursue this hobby of metal detecting, and not in contexts involving other kinds of detecting activity, such that it has acquired this particular narrowed non-compositional meaning. In other words, it would be a standard case of meaning modulation. So just take as an example of a possible conversation featuring the word. A asks, "What does your husband do at the weekends?" And B responds, "He goes out with his metal detector scouring the local beaches. He found some old coins last year and got very excited. He's become a very keen detectorist." Now, even if person A who asked the question has not come across this word before or isn't too sure about what it means, she's not going to have too much trouble figuring out its meaning, given the clear cognitive implications that he has an absorbing hobby that involves use of a metal detector, that it can result in finding valuable artifacts. And so by a mutual parallel adjustment backwards inference process, we get the narrowed meaning detectorist, non-compositional meaning. And we can pretty easily, perhaps too easily, concoct similar stories for how other cases have arisen via repeated use in particular types of contexts. So naturalize, with the non-compositional meaning of make a foreigner into a citizen of a country, is a pragmatic narrowing of the more general compositional meaning, natural plus eyes, which is roughly paraphrasable as simply to make natural. Just give a couple more examples before wrapping up. So reading, with the non-compositional meaning, reading star, perhaps, meaning interpretation, as in his reading of the novel was more allegorical than hers. It's probably best analyzed, I suggest, as involving a metonymic shift, given that arriving at an interpretation of a text is typically a result of a process or an act of reading, that is, of read plus ing. That text, reading that text. So it's a standard metonymic relation according to Bauer 2018. And thus, I guess we would have to say it's a new word for users. Seems to have been followed by some sort of broadening so that one can have a reading star not only of texts, but of situations and people. For example, on my reading of the situation, we are doomed. And then also, interestingly, it can occur, this particular meaning can occur as a verb. As I read the situation, we are doomed. So the verb seems to have acquired the same meaning, read star, meaning interpret, perhaps by some sort of back formation process. and thus the compositionality of reading, meaning interpretation, has been reinstated. But what we're dealing with here is two distinct words, according to the Wilson and Falcom account, at least. We could give a similar sort of account of the origin of the non-compositional meaning of transmission as a car's gearbox. And there's a narrowing of denotation, let's say, to the specific kind of transmission that takes place in the engine of a car, and then a metonymical shift to the object responsible for this specific kind of transmission, that is the gearbox, thereby creating a new word for language users. I'm just checking the time. Okay. So to sum up a bit here, in part one, I gave the standard account of meaning modulation, applying it to the case of so-called dual character concepts like philosopher, poet, potato. In part two, I looked at lexical innovation via metonymy, that is the forming of new words. In part three, I've suggested, this part that I've just finished, that the non-compositional meaning of morphologically complex words arises from various combinations of these two lexical pragmatic processes. And the final part, and I'm not actually going to go through these, it's only 2 slides. I might just leave this one up during the question time. I was going to look at just 2 notions of language to try to bring together the narrow notion of the generative syntactic system and the relation it has with the pragmatic user-based lexicon, as I see the lexicon as discussed in the literature. I don't think the syntactic system has a lexicon of a real sort. It has lists of roots and lists of functors, including affixes. So these are just, the basic elements of syntactic structures. Where the lexicon arises, the mental lexicon, is with us communicators. We have our basic communication units, words and other linguistic phrases that have become well established, conventionalized, so typically have non-compositional meanings. So we also have these phrasal idioms, spill the beans, etc., and certain frozen forms. So the pragmatic lexicon is a performance system in Chomsky's terms. It's entirely based in communication. It lies outside the linguistic competence system, and thus it registers properties that words have on the basis of the fact that they are used. So things like frequency, which would be irrelevant to the syntactic system. And this really is the last slide, and I'm not going to read it out. Perhaps anyone who's interested can quickly look at it. And I'll just stop there. I guess my final statement was going to be that there's a whole lot of different kinds of polysemy. And if we are interested in polysemy, we have to think about this. We have to think about pragmatic polysemy, ad hoc senses. We have to think about the conventionalization of some subset of those senses to give us lexical polysemy. And we have to think about a kind of hybrid polysemy distributed across the syntactic system and the lexicon, arising from the compositionality of the meaning of complex words, which is essentially a function of the syntax, and the non-compositional meanings of these same words, which is a function of communication and is registered in our pragmatic lexicons. Thank you.
Thank you, Robyn. That was very, very, very interesting. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions and comments. Maybe if you have questions, we can start with round of applause, of course. And then if you want to raise your hand, or if you have issues with the microphone, you can put them in a chat, but I will say, do I see, yes, Christoph?
Maybe I will stop screen sharing just so I can see a bit better. I can hardly see anybody.
Yeah.
How do I stop?
Can I do that from here? No, I can't. Yes.
Oh yeah, great.
I did it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kate.
Okay, so I think we got Christoph with hands up there.
Yeah, well, thanks, Robyn. That's a very interesting talk. And my question is, metonymy is word creation, and like with these yeah, complex words too, word creation. But that would wouldn't this imply that what kind of metonymies, what kind of new word categories could be established would be constrained by the grammar of the individual languages? What kind of word formations with roots and affixes are allowed? And how does this square with your observation that metonymy seems to be universal?
Okay, yes, absolutely. I missed out a huge chunk of the story because, well, partly because it's the end of a long day of intensive talks, and I thought perhaps introducing a whole lot of syntax might not be a brilliant idea at this stage of the game. But there is a syntactic story that needs to be told, absolutely, for sure. So I don't think it's enough to say, oh, well, metonymy can take you from a noun to a verb. No, it's not. I think the relationship between those senses can be construed as metonymic, and that this is what is, as it were, going on for the communicator. But as far as the syntax is concerned, basically, I would want to tell, well, I don't know whether I'd want to tell this story, but certain people are telling a story which I find attractive, certain syntacticians, about the root. So in the case of, let's say porch. Porch is a root, first and foremost, and it gets inserted into certain syntactic structures. So a nominal structure and a verbal structure, for example. And that would be an absolutely crucial part of this story, involving a category change for any new word. I just haven't told the story here. I've written a paper in which I do try to follow some of these syntacticians, Hagit Borer, Heidi Harley, Alec Morantz, and a whole bunch of other people who are telling a story of this sort. So you're absolutely right. Yeah, there's a big missing part of the story.
Do we have any other questions or comments? I think we have quite a bit of time still. Stavros?
Yes, hi. Thanks so much for yet another fascinating talk. I just wanted on the basis of the final slide, most of all. I mean, I agree completely with your analysis, and the example are really, really fantastic. I mean, I'm wondering, even though I suspect I know the answer, Chomsky once said that there is no semantics, there's just syntax and pragmatics. So I'm wondering where you're standing in relation to this, because the story as it goes sort of points towards this direction, that we're, diminishing a bit the role of a mental lexicon with some substance, and we are going towards a more pragmatic version of things. So just a comment, if you can. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Stavros. Yes, actually, in my abstract, I think the beginning of my abstract started with that very quote from Chomsky, which I absolutely love, because it sort of encourages us to look at the interaction between syntax and pragmatics, and the interaction actually between the narrow language faculty, as the generative grammarians think of it, and pragmatics, communication. So yeah, I am going in that direction. I mean, I wouldn't want to stick my neck out and say there's no such thing as semantics. It very much depends on how you want to define semantics, for one thing. Exactly. It seems perfectly reasonable to me to say that a lot of these polysemies wind up being a kind of semantic phenomenon through frequency of use, conventionalization. They become established. They become actual meanings of the word, senses of the word. So you can call that semantic if you want to. I wouldn't have an issue with that. But the origin of most of them, if not all of them, well, no, I don't want to say that, most of them is pragmatic.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think Deirdre's got a hand up as well.
Oh boy.
Okay, I remembered to demute. Robyn, that was a beautiful talk, very thought-provoking. And I just want to say one thing. Actually, there's one thing, you know, I used to really worry about the salt-pepper association thing. I'm much happier about the role of association in communication now, but I think just an optimal relevance thing will do for salt-pepper. If there's both salt and pepper there, you're not going to say salt when you mean pepper, because you won't be understood, because it would be just as easy to say pepper. And even when the salt and pepper aren't together and there's pepper there, and you say, you know, I'd like some pepper to mean salt, no one's going to understand you. So I think there's actually just a simple optimal relevance thing that'll rule that out. I don't know whether that's true, but it just occurred to me as you were talking. The other thing I'm sort of, I hesitated to say it, but I do think it's true. And Ingrid and I are actually, first, we're still working on metaphor. We've had to break off for various reasons for a moment. And one of the big challenges of metonymy was that you have to learn so much traditional linguistics, as you and I both discovered, and that nearly killed me. But actually, I've come to the opposite conclusion, and I think Ingrid has as well, from cognitive linguistics. The worry about cognitive linguistics is they see metonymy everywhere, and you were sort of going in that direction. And I think it would be good not to. We should take a really deflationary view of metonymy and say it doesn't exist really. So let's get rid of the theory. You don't need a theoretical term metonymy any more than you need a theoretical term metaphor. Though, you know, there's more case for metaphor than there is for metonymy. What's going on is a lot of processes that don't need to be treated as a single natural kind. And actually, when, you know, Ingrid and I have been, one of the reasons we've been slow in coming out with our conclusions on metonymy is because actually I think it breaks down into two quite different sorts, and Ingrid and I are planning to talk about that. But anyway, so I'm not going in the direction of metonymy as universal. I'm going in the direction of there's a lot of things go on that involve association and that aren't metaphor and that aren't irony, but don't try and make a theoretical term out of them because you collapse. So that was just a thought anyway. Wasn't that an instruction to you? That was an instruction to cognitive linguists.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm completely at one with that. If I properly understood you, I mean, we can call all these disparate associative relations metonymy, I suppose, just so that we've got a distinct term from the other terms that we use, metaphor and meaning modulation and so forth. But yeah, I also don't want to see it in the way that the cognitive linguists tend to see it, as, you know, absolutely popping up all over the place. But these kinds of, I keep seeing, now that I've started thinking about it and listening to you talking about metonymy as new word coinage and so forth, I've started noticing how many of these kinds of relations, whatever we want to call them, and they may be different sorts of them and so forth, you know, it's just become, as happens when one starts thinking about something, you start noticing them all over the place. And so whether or not there's a single thing that we want to call metonymy, or whether or not that's just a very loose way of talking about a whole bunch of different sorts of associative relations which are salient to us, yeah, that may be so. I'm
sure that you and I are agreed on the theory of it, but I think the danger of using the term metonymy is that then one would then be tempted to look for a definition of contiguity, for example, and it's really, really very hard. And so, you know, trying to build a theoretical notion of metonymy is much harder than trying to build a theoretical notion of metaphor. Whereas, you know, the notion of lexical innovation is beautiful. Why do we need to add anything? So I think maybe just being cautious about sort of encouraging the labeling of anything that isn't metaphor and irony as metonymy, you know, might help us I mean, goodness knows, because Ingrid and I have taken years over it, but it might be, you know, it might be holding us up. That's all.
I suppose there are quite a few kinds of lexical innovation, though.
Yeah.
So, you know, the affixations, for example, I can produce new verbs, eyes with the eyes affix, and new nouns with various nominal affixes, and so on and so forth. And those ones seem to work a little bit differently from the ones that we're calling metonymy. So, you know, there's still, for me, certainly for me, there's still a lot that I would need to work out there. And I just found the Bauer idea. First of all, I thought it was mad. You know, I thought, oh, you can't be right about that. And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought that the relations between the nouns and verbs in the conversion cases were remarkably similar to the relations between the noun, so-called metonymies. So that's sort of where I'm at the moment. But yeah, I'm very open to breaking this down into something sort of a bit more systematic than that.
Yeah, I think it'd be fun. Thank you.
Okay, now I think we've got Didier with hands up. We're 5 o'clock, but maybe just 1 minute if Didier can ask questions very quickly.
Sure, I can do that. In fact, it's just going back to that salt and pepper example, and rebounding on what Deirdre said. I think indeed that the problem is the binariness of it, because I don't know if you're also familiar with those spice trays that you can find at restaurants, where you have more than just salt and pepper, but you have salt, pepper, and toothpicks and stuff. And I can see that you could actually ask for that little tray by saying, "Can you pass the salt, please?" And then that would work. But it's not binary. There are more than two options there.
Yeah, I guess you could. And whether or not you want to call that metonymy or not, I don't know. The reason I'm interested in the phonology side of things, and goodness knows, you know, I know nothing about phonology. So this is just another hurdle. But it's striking, isn't it, that the words feed and eat, for example, could be said, their senses have a lot of semantic overlap and relation, and there's a clear semantic relation there, but we don't treat that as polysemy. Why don't we? Well, because they're so phonologically distinct. And so I was trying to carry over that thinking into the salt and pepper case, but there may be lots of reasons why, by and large, we don't use salt to refer to pepper, the reasons that Deirdre gave. And now you're saying, well, in certain circumstances, we actually might do that. You know, so, okay, there's a lot to think about here. With regard to salt and pepper, you know, there's a lot to think about.